will talk a little bit about Ukraine and its developments after the election. So, as you probably know, having following the news, Ukraine has had 2 rounds of presidential elections this spring, and then it has been followed by parliamentary elections. But first, I would like to introduce Ukraine to you. And in case you want to add something, you're very welcome to do that. Well, maybe we can start from that. Do you know anything about Ukraine, in fact? Maybe some famous names? Anything? Just shoot. Shevchenko, yes, we have some football fans here, so very well. And in fact, today he has been named one of the top trainers, right? So I just checked the news so we can relate to this discussion, although I am not very knowledgeable about football. Anyhow, Shevchenko is a very famous Ukrainian last name. It's very popular. There are different people who have this last name. So a little bit more about Ukraine, more facts, fast facts. If we disregard Russia in this case, Ukraine can be considered Europe's largest by territory country in Europe, right? If we consider Russia, then Russia by territory is the largest one. And when it comes to the population, it is pretty large, but not the largest, 44 million people. How many people live in Sweden? How many Swedish citizens does this country have?
10 million.
Yeah? So it's about 4.5 Swedens in Ukraine in terms of population. Ukraine is a relatively young country. It has regained its independence in 1991, which makes it about 28 years old. So an adult person, judging by human age, right? Ukraine has been independent for a few years in the 20th century, after the First World War, after the Bolshevik Revolution. Ukrainian elites managed to secure independence for a few years, but this didn't last for long. Ukraine was reoccupied by the Bolsheviks after that very short period of time. But still, the regaining of independence in 1991 is framed as regaining, not gaining, but regaining. And also Ukraine is very known for its historical sites, one of which is, for instance, one of the world's heritage sites. It is an 11th century Saint Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv. I advise you to visit that place, it's very interesting. Also, some would say that Ukraine can be called a heart of Europe, because if you draw lines in Europe, Ukraine will be in the center, in the middle of Europe. But again, it's quite arbitrary, depends where you start counting Europe. Is it before the mountains in Russia or wherever you decide, right? So it's quite arbitrary, but still, you might hear Ukraine referred to as the center or the heart of Europe. And also something that, well, you will know, but many do not know, you're not supposed to call Ukraine the Ukraine. Because if you say the Ukraine, it essentially means that you refer to the Soviet Republic of Ukraine, right? So if you study history and you want to describe something that has happened during the Soviet period of time, and you would say the Ukraine, that will be correct, because you would refer to the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. And the Ukraine in this context is just the short name for the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. So therefore, when you sometimes hear some people saying the Ukraine in the present context, that doesn't make much sense, because the Ukraine is used for the Soviet kind of territory, right? So if you refer to independent Ukraine since 1991, you're supposed to use word Ukraine without the abstract. And also, if you're interested in subway and how this infrastructure is being built, in Ukraine, in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine, Arsenalная station is known to be the deepest metro station, right? So you have to spend quite a long time riding the escalator to go very deep underground before you can ride the train. So you will find yourself at approximately 100 meters below the ground. So it's a pretty long ride by the escalator. And also Ukraine is very famous for being an agricultural country. It has about 5 to 6 harvests per year for grains and other agricultural goods. So it exports a lot to Europe in particular. And historically, it has been referred as a breadbasket of Europe because it used to conduct this agricultural business throughout the centuries, so to say. And one of the reasons why it is because of its black soils, some sort of soils that make this agricultural production possible. So some special sort of soils that are used for agriculture. But now let's talk about the elections. Enough with the fast facts. As I said, we had 2 rounds of the presidential elections, and we had 2 main candidates, the former president Petro Poroshenko and newly elected President Volodymyr Zelensky. And you can see that, well, actually these elections were rather popular among Ukrainians. Many came and casted their votes for one or the other. In fact, we can see that turnout was about 62–63%, which is quite good turnout for an average European country. So in Sweden, you would see probably similar turnout numbers. And do you know what turnout means? No? So it basically means how many people eligible to vote actually came and casted their votes, right? So among those who can vote, they came and voted. And these were 63–62% of people. So quite a high number, one would say. And as you can see, the results are quite positive for the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky. So he scored 73% out of those that came and voted. 73% of population actually supported him. These are high numbers in the context of Ukraine, but also in context of other European and non-European countries. And one can say that these high numbers were a result of failure of the former president. One could say that, well, this new face, Zelensky, who is coming from show business, who is known for his satire, political satire, but also films. So he's seen very much as an anti-establishment, an outsider, who just came into the politics to drain the swamp, in a way. And he, in this way, also referred to different arguments used in other countries, portraying himself as, well, the one who will be fighting corruption, who will be fighting old, corrupt elites, trying to portray himself as a new person, new blood, new ideas, creative, dynamic, and young. So that's how he was trying to portray himself. And many would say that the outstanding results that he has obtained during this election is a result of the failure of the president that preceded him, Petro Poroshenko. And in particular, corruption schemes that investigative journalists brought to the light, right? So it was pretty obvious that the previous president, Petro Poroshenko, that he has been given a blind eye, so to say, to many corruption schemes, and that, of course, displeased people, and they wanted just drain the swamp. And let's look into the map of Ukraine, right? The green area is the area that, or where Volodymyr Zelensky scored the highest, where he won, right? And we can see that even during the first round of the election, the presidential election, his support was rather stunning all around the country. So this area, you can see, is marked gray because these areas are occupied by Russia, right? So no elections can be held there because there are no representatives of Ukrainian state. There can't be any elections held there because there are no authorities that would represent Ukrainian state. So likewise, when it comes to the second round, we can see absolutely the same picture, right? So we can see that Volodymyr Zelensky, won in all of the areas in Ukraine except this one western area. It's Lviv region where Petro Poroshenko won, the former president, right, who wanted to have the second term. But one thing that is in particular important or quite interesting, I would say, it is that foreign electoral districts, basically meaning Ukrainian citizens who live abroad outside of Ukraine, they predominantly voted for Petro Poroshenko, the former president, right? That's quite interesting that everywhere, except in Ukraine itself, people supported the previous president. And if we take a look into the parliamentary elections and how President Zelensky's popularity has been translated into the popularity of his party, Servant of the People, we can see a similar trend in a way, we can see that in fact his popularity was rather high, right? He was very popular, and it became even higher. So he increased in terms of popularity. So his scores increased, and also when it came to the elections, well, the Servant of the People Party, they scored the most. And we will now come to the distribution of seats. But when we see, for instance, again, the former president Petro Poroshenko and his party's results, which is called European Solidarity, or previously it used to be called Solidarity, just Solidarity. So we can see that his scores were just decreasing, right? Not that good news for the former president and his party. And this is how the votes are currently distributed in the parliament. So Ukrainian parliament in total has 450 seats. And these are 254 seats that representatives of the Servant of the People Party currently have. So they have majority of seats in the parliament, and that is enough to make some decisions, right? So when you vote in the parliament, you need to score majority to approve legislation or move forward some particular issues, and now they can do that themselves if they decide so, and if they coordinate, of course. That is rather unprecedented picture. It is rather uncommon for Ukraine and many other European countries that one party has a majority. Usually parliaments are built on the premises that, well, different parties have to find a consensus. They have to talk to each other, they need to find a compromise. But here, it's possible that maybe Ukrainian parliament will be making decisions faster, maybe not always in the most transparent way, if there is some coherence in between the members of Servant of the People Party. It remains to be seen. But there are already some indicators showing that, well, maybe the president has a little bit too much power over his party, and maybe he exercises it in not the most transparent way. And there's a lot of criticism. So you can read some news that would say that, well, accusing the party of being a crazy printer, for instance, saying that they're just issuing laws or issuing new legislation and voting for it really crazily fast. Whatever is coming from the president's office, from his administration, will go to the parliament and will be voted very fast. So there are some speculations that go along these lines. And also you can see that majority of Ukraine, with some exceptions, supported representatives of Servant of the People, the party of the current president. And one of the reasons people would say is that Ukrainian citizens wanted to give more power and more capacity to the newly elected president. As you saw from the previous slides, he has been elected with 73% of support, right? Which means a lot. And having also parliament that is an extra coin or extra currency to help him drive through his reforms that he was campaigning on the base of. So that is tremendous support from the population to the current president and his party. Right, but then what do people want? Okay, they like the president or the candidate who became the president. They wanted to give him extra trust, or they gave him extra trust and extra power by supporting his party. But what do they actually want? What do citizens of Ukraine prefer or consider to be the most important issues? And these, you might think, are simple, understandable issues, such as peace. Well, in fact, in case of Ukraine, you saw that, well, some territory of Ukraine has been occupied currently, right? So it's pretty obvious that people want peace and stability. 74% of Ukrainians say that it is the most pressing issue, the most important issue. And people expect the president to actually do something about that, try to find solutions to the ongoing war. But then, what solutions do they mean? What type of solutions would they accept? We're talking about democracy, right? Whatever the president does, it has to be accepted. It has to be seen legitimate by the people. And then people are not ready just to storm the areas that have been currently occupied by Russia. People do not support storming these areas with military. Only 17% of people actually would somehow support this idea. Neither people are agreeing on Russia's term at any cost. They do not want to agree whatever Russia says, right? They want to find some middle grounds. And they're ready to have compromises. In fact, 50% believe that some sort of compromises are possible, but not all, right? And that means that, well, the president will need to take these numbers into consideration, excluding these two extremes, trying to find the middle ground. The second issue that Ukrainians bring up when identifying the most pressing issues, it is, of course, economy and prosperity. 51% say that, well, president should firstly address salaries and pensions. And then the third most pressing issue that Ukrainians identify, it is the fight against corruption. 35% of population, in fact, state that this is the most pressing issue. And of course, probably you have heard about Ukraine being corrupt in the context from the current debates in the US and the situation in which Ukraine got dragged in unintentionally or intentionally, who knows. But this is something that Ukrainians also believe has to be addressed. And now we will go through each of these things that Ukrainians identify as the most important pressing issues. But first, I will also want to walk you through the topics that are probably not that popular, because whatever we do, we can be liked by everybody equally, right? The same goes for the government and the president. So, well, a few things that he has been pushing through hardly lately didn't find that much appreciation from the side of the population. Have you ever heard a term of economic liberalization? Do you know what economic liberalization means? Yeah, what does it mean?
Well, it depends on the context, but it's mostly about privatization and privatization of state-owned firms.
Indeed, very good. Thank you. Thank you for the answer on this question. That's what the president wants to do. He wants to address the second most pressing issue in Ukraine, well, economic well-being, by introducing liberal reforms. Ukraine doesn't have any system that would regulate ownership of land. And as we talked earlier, Ukraine has good land. So this land can be used, this soil can be used for agriculture or whatnot. But there is no clear law that would grant you or anybody else property rights on that land. In Sweden, you can buy a piece of land. In Ukraine, you can only rent it. That is it. And the president wants to reform the legislation in such a way that people will have right to buy the land. So you buy it and then you pass it through the generations to your children, grandchildren, etc. But surprisingly, not everybody supports this idea. So about 58% do not actually support the idea of selling land into private hands. And why is that? It is because the current way how the legislation is written is very shady. It's not very transparent. Who will be those individuals who will have the right to buy the land? Well, just imagine Ukraine is in the state of war with Russia, and in case if Russians are buying Ukrainian land through some proxies in Ukraine, will it be acceptable? Well, probably not. And many Ukrainians are afraid of that, and therefore you can see their fears expressed or reflected in this number, right? So all of that potentially could be changed if the legislation is written in a transparent form, where it is clearly demarcated who is permitted to buy, who is not permitted to buy land, and for what purposes, right? It is a complex issue, and it has a lot of attention now in Ukraine, so not that many people actually talk now in Ukraine about presidential impeachment, possible impeachment in the US, but everybody talks about land reform because it is considered to be rather crucial. Then something else that goes in line with liberalization, it is indeed privatization of state-owned companies. Ukraine has the Soviet history, 70 years of Soviet history. And during those times, all the property that was in that territory, on that territory, that all belonged to the state, right? And this legacy still lives on, and many big companies, they are still owned by the state. They are not privatized, so people have nothing to say about that. And the current president and the government, they see an opportunity here that, well, if we let these companies be privatized, maybe this could bring in some foreign direct investments from abroad. Maybe there will be some larger companies buying some stakes and shares of those state-owned companies. It is seen as a potential source of additional revenues. Third important thing that the president is trying to address currently, it is legalization of casinos and gaming business. While currently in Ukraine it is not permitted openly to arrange a casino business, but with this new legislation it might be possible that you can open up. Of course, casinos exist on the ground and everybody has an opportunity to game, shall one want, but the president proposes to open up this business as well and regulate it in a more civilized way, so to say. So, a little bit on the situation with the ongoing war. You can see that this area is currently under the occupation. So Russian forces and Russian-supported separatists are currently exercising control over this area. This area is Crimea Peninsula. It is occupied by the Russian Federation and it has been annexed in spring 2014. And the military operation started in February 2014. So this de facto belongs to Russia, right? But internationally it is not recognized as a part of Russia, it is recognized as part of Ukraine. This area Russia didn't claim to belong to her. This area Russia wants to return, to push back in Ukraine on its own terms. So this situation, the ongoing war with Russia, caused a situation where while 7% of Ukraine's territory is currently being occupied by Russian or Russian-supported forces. And that situation also led to 1.5 million internally displaced people. And this is about as many as in the whole Stockholm's land. So just imagine the whole Stockholm's land needing to move somewhere, to Skåne or somewhere else, right? The whole Stockholm's land had to move somewhere. That's how many people Ukraine has to accommodate in the rest of the territory. And of course, this creates a very difficult humanitarian situation where these people need housing, need extra financial support to get settled in the new places, etc. That would involve moving somewhere else, right? And of course, sadly enough, it is now over 13,000 people that died in the war. And most of these are civilians, not people who are actively engaged into the war, but civilians who just happened or were unlucky enough to live in these areas. And yeah, that is pretty sad. So, of course, this situation affects everybody in Ukraine economically, and yeah, I will show you some charts with inflation rate and GDP, and you'll see that, well, it had tremendous economic impact on everybody. Of course, people are dying every day, but everybody can feel its impact or impact of the war because of the economic situation. And there are intentions, or there are good intentions to solve this situation and have some sort of negotiations with Russia, trying to come into terms and solve this situation. Facing deadlock in 2016 in the Minsk negotiations, so Minsk peace process, Steinmeier, former foreign minister of Germany, proposed two parties, well, Ukraine and Russia, to agree on something that would specify the sequence of events, how this war can be resolved. So, and in particular, Steinmeier said that, well, let's push back this territory that is being currently occupied by Russia, except Crimea, but eastern Ukraine. Let's push back this territory to Ukraine. Let's give it back to Ukraine, but somehow on Russian terms. which means that, well, there will be elections held in those areas. And these elections will be held under the Ukrainian legislation, basically according to the law of Ukraine. And then the results or the conduct of these elections will be supervised by OSCE. Do you guys know what is OSCE? It is Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, right? And they conduct these observatory missions rather regularly in different countries. And of course, they're involved in these processes in Ukraine when it comes to elections. And then once OSCE says that, well, these elections took place in fair and a free environment, then these areas where elections will be held, they will get automatically status of self-governing areas. So basically they'll have more autonomy than they have currently. So they'll have a veto, for instance, power on whatever decision Ukraine as a state makes, etc. And once the special status has been granted to those areas, Ukraine will obtain the control over its border, because currently the border in those areas kind of occupied by Russian-supported forces and Russian forces, that border is currently under control of Russia. And Russia is ready to give it after the elections, in a way. Although it is a clear and short, concise sequence of events, it creates many more issues and poses many more questions than previous formats of cooperations, or not cooperation, but rather negotiation with Russia, meaning the Minsk formats. In particular, it's not very clear how journalists or political parties, representatives of these political parties, will have access to these areas, right? Because, well, this area is filled with FSB, with Russian special forces, with weapons, so probably there won't be that many brave people who would want to risk their lives and go to those areas to actually present their program or their party. Right? Also, how can you have any elections when there's no freedom of media? Media is under direct control currently in the east of Ukraine, in those occupied areas, by the local militia, so to say. So how will it happen if people won't get any objective information, if it has been controlled by some particular group of people? So there's no way that people will get enough information to make unbiased choice. So these questions are not specified in the Steinmeier formula, and this Steinmeier formula is seen as very much benefiting Russia rather than Ukraine. And in fact, when everybody else in Europe and beyond talked about impeachment inquiry, in Ukraine, most of the people talked about giving up to Russia or not giving up to Russia. Right? And 10,000 of people actually came down to the main street, Hrещатик, and the main square, Maidan Nезалежності. Maidan, you might have heard in the context of the Maidan revolution. This is a physical space where it took place. So basically, people were quite angry with this particular solution, or quite many were angry. And the president has to, of course, take into consideration what people think about the Steinmeier formula, sequence of events, and the whole endeavor with elections in self-governing status in those areas that are currently being occupied. So, given the situation that there's very little transparency in how this all will happen and how the elections will take place, of course, journalists ask the president and people close to him, well, what it all means and how it will all be conducted. Toward Zelensky, the current president, said that there won't be any elections under the barrel of a gun. What he means by that, how does he envision withdrawal of Russian troops from eastern Ukraine, that is not very clear. It has not been specified anywhere, so remains to be seen. And also, it's not very transparent and clear what self-governing status of Donbass actually means, how much veto power it will have over the decisions of Verkhovna Rada, Parliament of Ukraine. That also remains to be specified, and a lot will depend on the powers, if there will be any powers granted or any autonomy status granted. So it's very important to know to what extent that area can block Ukraine's decision as a state, right? And then we are approaching the end of the presentation. The third most pressing issue that Ukrainians identify currently in Ukraine, well, it is omnipresent corruption, especially corruption on the highest levels, meaning the government, right? And in this context, the current president, Zelensky, is very much connected to Ihor Kolomoisky. Well, and I should specify that he is connected in reports and investigative journalism pieces. He is connected by people who research his background and his history to this oligarch who is quite famous for money laundering, for corruption schemes on the highest level. Just to give you an impression or an understanding of the extent of the corruption that this person is engaged. So he withdrew from the bank that he owned about 6 billion of US dollars. So $6 billion just disappeared, and that gap had to be covered from the budget of Ukraine in 2014 when Ukraine faced military aggression from the side of Russia. Right? It was tremendous negative impact on Ukrainian economy, and International Monetary Fund stepped in and provided Ukraine with financial loans that Ukraine is paying back now. But this money just disappeared, and the state had to cover for this money. And what Kolomoisky wants now, he wants this bank to come back to him, basically. He wants to get back this bank, which means that he's not getting only this bank, he's getting 6 billion. Because the gap is covered by the state, right? So the money disappeared and then came from the state. So he's a clever person, wanting a lot, and seemed to have very close ties to the president. Journalists show different communication channels that he has, which are not very transparent. For instance, in 2017 and 18, back then, physical and private person Zelensky, before he announced that he'll run for the presidency, he was regularly visiting Kolomoisky, this oligarch, in Geneva. And journalists from Radio Liberty, they actually managed to establish the sequence of the flights. So they tracked him, basically, and they showed that, well, look, he doesn't seem to be that independent of this oligarch. And one thing that in Ukraine can be praised, that is the quality of journalism and investigative journalism. So politicians are under very close scrutiny of journalists, for which the journalists themselves often suffer different attacks, including physically. But thanks to those journalists, we know about corruption schemes and money laundering schemes, etc. So coming to the economy, as I promised to you, just a short glance on the situation, a quick glance. So inflation in Ukraine is rather high, that is unprecedented. 15%, 14% is projected for the end of this year, 2020, 12%, and if we are lucky enough to 2029, it will be 11%. To compare that with Sweden, in Sweden, inflation rate is about 2%, right? So 6 times more inflation, best case scenario, 2021. So no wonder why Ukrainians identify economic situation as one of the most pressing. At the same time, talking about inflation is not enough. We also need to talk a little bit about GDP, right? So if GDP is large enough and if it grows fast enough, well, basically inflation wouldn't matter that much. But we don't see that from the numbers. So we can see that GDP is increasing, but while best case scenario will have 4% GDP by 2021, right? So economic problems are there. They are there to stay. They are not that likely actually to be solved. 4% GDP increase, inflation 13% or 11% if we are lucky enough. At the same time, the current government are promising about 40% GDP increase in comparison to 2018. So basically they are promising that by the end of the term in power, they'll manage to bring up GDP by 40%, which is, well, not that realistic, I believe. Maybe this is one of the populist arguments that is very much characteristic for Ukrainian politics, and unfortunately not only for Ukrainian politics. And these are other projections, economic. So no way there can be any 40% increase, right? So the best case scenario, according to different forecasts provided by private corporations like Goldman Sachs forecast or IMF, well, best case scenario, again, 4.1 GDP increase in 2021. So quite unlikely that there will be 40% increase by the end of the term. So I hope that you liked the presentation, that you found this information interesting. And in case if you are interested enough in this topic, I can suggest you a few sources where you can get even more information and hopefully very engaging information. For instance, if you're interested in history of Ukraine, there is a new book written by Anne Applebaum, which is called Red Famine. And this one examines Stalin man-made hunger in Ukraine to fight back Ukrainian movement for independent state. So that's how he managed to keep Ukraine within the Soviet Union by basically starving, well, modest estimations are about 4 million people, half of Sweden. So he starved to death half of Sweden, and that's how he managed to keep Ukraine in the Soviet Union. Fascinating work. Applebaum, very much recommended. Buy this book today if you can. It is in Swedish as well. It is translated to Swedish. It's a fantastic book. More generally about Ukrainian history throughout the centuries, Orest Subtelny, a famous Canadian historian, wrote a book on history of Ukraine, very interesting. Conquest, a person, researcher preceding Applebaum, but writing on the same topic, The Harvest of Sorrow. Fantastic historical book, also very much recommended. And then Serhiy Plokhy, it is a historian that I would recommend you to keep your eye on. He's very good and very thorough in his methodology. He wrote about Chernobyl, for instance. This book helped the creators of the miniseries, HBO miniseries, a lot. So if you like the series, please read the book. Probably you'll find more interesting details in the book. So he's a very good historian. Check him out. But if you feel too bored to read, there will be a few events this autumn and winter, which I could recommend you to visit. Well, first, the soon coming Ukrainian Days, arranged by Östgruppen and Young Ukrainians in Sweden. Östgruppen is an organization, an NGO, that supports human rights and democracy in Eastern Europe. They'll have a series of events from the 3rd to the 5th December. Very interesting. Then there will be Ukrainian Film Festival. And during this festival, there will be one movie actually about hunger in Ukraine, this man-made hunger that I just recently talked to you about, by a Polish filmmaker, and the role of journalism and disinformation. So it's a nice movie. Well, it's not a nice movie. It's a sad movie, but well made. It is about historical events, but one can relate because there are many topics that are currently happening, well, such as disinformation and role of journalists. Well, of course, you're always welcome to visit our seminars at Utrikespolitiska institutet, and we have quite a few seminars on Eastern Europe, Ukraine in particular, European Union, whatnot. Please come and listen. Then there are also some interesting public seminars and educational programs at Södertörn Högskola. So in case you feel like devoting your life into studying history or political science with focus on Eastern Europe, you can do that in Södertörn. But also Uppsala. Iris Institute is dealing with a similar topic, and you can pursue academic career or learn more about history, politics, and society in these two places, in case you've been thinking about choosing your path. With that, I would like to finish. Thank you for your attention.